Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. We have a few moments before our blood sugars drop, so we're going to fight against that. But I think if you see the amazing speakers that we have today, we're in for a real treat. This plenary session is going to deal with one of the compelling challenges of our planet, and it's going to be on global environmental health and the Anthropocene. I'm going to introduce the speakers now briefly. Please take a look at their biographies, because if I was to go through the biographies, we would definitely chew up an hour and a half, because they are superstars in their field. The first in the order that they'll be speaking will be Dr. John Patz. Dr. Patz is not only a CUGH board member, professor and John Holton Chair, the Director of Global Health of the Global Health Institute at the University of Wisconsin. He is one of the leaders in planetary health within CUGH. And John, thank you for being here. He's also never ever go and take a race on cross-country skis with him, because you stand no chance. Renee Salas is one of the extraordinary young scientists that has been doing incredible work in the field. She is a Burke Fellow at affiliated faculty at Harvard Global Health Institute, and she is the leader in the Global Health Countdown, and she's at the Harvard Medical School. Also, we are really privileged to have Dr. Judy Amombo. Dr. Amombo is the program manager for postdoctoral affairs at the African Academy of Sciences, and Dr. Amombo made an absolutely heroic effort to get here. Judy, thank you very much for being here. Dr. Jonna Mazet is one of the early and most internationally recognized leaders in the One Health field. She is a professor and executive director of the University of California Davis One Health Institute, and she is a veterinarian by trade, but one of the public scientists in many ways in this field. So, Jonna, thank you for being here. And Dr. Phil Landrigan is a professor and director of the Global Observatory on Pollution and Health. He's the director of the Global Public Health Programs at Boston College. He's also the co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Pollution. If you have a chance to pick up that document, it's extraordinary, and he's now working on another version of that, 2.0, plus a Lancet Commission report on pollution and health in India. So thank you, Phil, for being here. So I'll just start with, I'm going to give a short introduction. I've got a few minutes, I think, to sort of set the stage here. Could I have my slides, please? Fantastic. So what I wanted to just spend a few minutes speaking about is the opportunity we have to be able to deal with a challenge that continually and chronically gets neglected politically. We know that we are eviscerating our planet's life support systems, and in the process, we are actually undermining the ability of our species to survive. And unfortunately, environmental priorities and conservation priorities fall to the bottom of the barrel. But what I'm going to go through to you today is some opportunities of what we can actually do to address this pressing challenge and align it with existing interests where there's money and where there's political support. So we know that the environmental challenges affect, obviously, the ecosystem services that affect us, but they also have powerful impacts upon non-communicable diseases, infectious diseases, economics, and security. So what can we do about it? Opportunity number one. We can link environmental health challenges not only to infectious disease changes, but also to non-communicable diseases and the Sustainable Development Goals. Non-communicable diseases affect 70%, or cause 70% of deaths worldwide, receive just 2% of funding. But what's interesting is that green spaces can be a powerful impact upon non-communicable diseases. So there's a huge opportunity that we have to link the health benefits and ecosystem services, which I don't think we do a good enough job doing. The next opportunity is on the issue of health and security outcomes. If at the cabinet table you want to move anything forward, it's really important to be able to get the defense community on your side. And what defense departments around the world understand clearly is that climate change is a clear and present threat to security issues. The degradation of ecosystem services is a major driver and can be a major driver of insecurity. As populations grow, fighting for limited ecosystem services, you can have conflict insecurity. And we're seeing that in parts of the Sahel in Africa, where Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and other terrorist organizations are born in part out of areas where there's massive insecurity in terms of the ecosystem services that exist there. So whether we're talking about pollinators, food security, marine challenges, and a collapse of marine stocks, food stocks worldwide, these have profound impact upon the health and welfare of people around the world. Climate change is a security threat. We've seen a number of powerful documents. What's interesting is a few years ago, we actually took a look at what Defense Department has been giving to Congress. And they came out with a report for the US Senate that said clearly that climate change is a major security threat to every country in the world. So this is something, a way for us, I think, to frame what we want to do in terms of getting greater attention and policies and action to address the environmental challenges we face, not only climate change. Biodiversity loss. We're in the 6th extinction right now on our planet. We are poised to lose 30 to 50% of all species on the planet by the middle of this century. Think about that for a second. We are tearing apart the biodiversity, the fabric of nature within this planet, and it has a profound impact on every species, including our own. There are hotspots that have been identified by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and those could be an area of focus where we can focus our attention to mainstreaming conservation into development initiatives that will enable us to attract the resources and programs that will enable us to protect ecosystems as well as improve the health and welfare of the people who live near those areas. Strengthen the global health security agenda. This is an incredible opportunity to be able to strengthen that agenda, and in so doing, we can actually address gaps identified by the joint, the JEE, the Joint External Evaluations, and those gaps in the global health security agenda will enable us to be able to prevent, detect, and respond to deadly infectious diseases. It is also, interestingly enough, of course, a public health platform. So the global health security agenda, while intended to prevent pandemics, it's as a public health platform, it can also double as a way to address non-communicable diseases, which also require, as we know, public health interventions to impact them. I'm going to quickly close because I want to make sure the other speakers have a chance to speak. But we also need to do a better job, I think, of integrating environmental health, planetary health, One Health curricula into across all disciplines. Because we all need to have a little understanding about what this means, whether you're an economist or whether you're a physician or a nurse or an engineer. It's important to understand this in the execution of your duties. We did that. Last couple of slides, I'll leave that one. This is really for us to focus on strengthening public institutions, as Dr. Garcia mentioned so eloquently earlier today. We focus on the top of this pyramid, on what we need to do for Sustainable Development Goals, but you can't deliver public goods effectively without having an effective public institutions below them. And so just for your thought, we need to redouble our efforts on working with countries to strengthen public institutions so they have the capability of implementing what we need to do to address the SDGs. Finally, as I mentioned before, advocacy and implementation are vital. If we're not advocating, if we're not moving the political goalposts, then we're not doing our job. The public moves the political. So again, I just want to really emphasize and stress that together, our job is also to inform the public in ways that not only appeal to the brain, but more importantly, even appealing to their heart. Creating an emotional response for people in what we need them to do is really important for them to be able to understand what they need to do. So I'm just going to close there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to ask Dr. Patz to come up and give us his talk. Thank you.
Keith, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and present. I'm going to be welcoming you to the Anthropocene. If I could have the first slide. So, global health in the Anthropocene era, which is where we are affecting everything on Earth. So humans are affecting the world, which is why we have this new era. And because today is International Women's Day, I do want to honor one of my superheroes, Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Director General of the WHO, former Prime Minister of Norway, Deputy Chair of the Elders, and also she was the lead chair for it's called the Brundtland Commission Report from 1987, Our Common Future. This is the Bible in sustainable development. And she came up with this idea that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And at our institution in Wisconsin, we adopt this for sustainable global health, health for today without compromising the health for tomorrow. So to Gro Brundtland, this is great. Inspiration to me and many of us. So as Keith said, we are really putting pressure on the Earth's resources. You can see this acceleration of carbon dioxide, deforestation, biodiversity loss, nitrogen pollution. Things are really affecting the world's climate. And so we are pushing against planetary boundaries. And this was work by Stefan and Rockstrom, pointing out planetary boundaries. Once you go beyond that inner green circle, you're consuming natural resources faster than they can replenish themselves, and you have a risk of no return. Like you can see biodiversity loss. When you go extinct, you're not coming back. So these are planetary boundaries. And so now, with this realization, we need to start combining the concept of sustainable development goals and planetary boundaries as we advocate for global health. The World Health Organization came out with a report for the Rio +20, the Rio Convention, and you can see the title, Our Planet, Our Health, Our Future, and showing how human health intersected with the International Treaty on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the International Treaty on Desertification, that health cuts across all of these big environmental issues. And of course, more recently, we had the Lancet Commission report on planetary health. So I would make an obvious statement that it's not logical to think that we can have healthy people on a sick planet. So for considering these planetary boundaries, myself and Dr. Salas, we're going to talk about the climate change issue. And then Dr. Omumba and Dr. Landrigan will talk about other environmental stressors on the boundaries, planetary boundaries. So for climate change, I just want to tell you it's not your imagination that the Earth is warming up. I'm going to show you trends in surface temperature over the northern hemisphere over the last few decades. So pay attention, watch this carefully. So 1951 to 1980, 83 to 93, 94 to 2004, 2005 to 2015. You can see the world is really heating up. And especially look at that extreme red. Those are the extreme hot temperatures where we have major health issues. We've actually conducted studies for the United States, and we show in most cities we've looked at, and this is pretty much all big cities east of the Mississippi River, we see a nearly tripling in the number of very hot days, hotter than 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees centigrade. This is the town that's just north of here, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that right now, on average, only has 9 days that are 90 degrees or hotter. But by mid-century, they'll have almost 3 times that many hot days. And we know that heat waves kill people. So when we talk about climate change, what are we actually talking about? We're looking at temperature rise, sea level rise from thermal expansion of salt water and land-based glaciers sliding into the ocean, but also hydrologic extremes, extremes of the water cycle, meaning more droughts, floods, and fires. And the so what about climate change for our own health community is that climate affects us through multiple pathways, be it through heat waves, and especially in big cities, the urban heat island effect, stagnant air pollution, and effects on ragweed pollen and aeroallergens, infectious diseases, especially carried by cold-blooded insects, so vector-borne diseases, and waterborne diseases, if we're thinking about extremes of the hydrologic cycle, more flooding and contamination. And of course, our health depends on adequate water and food supplies. On the bottom one, mental health from storm disasters, post-traumatic stress, and forced environmental refugees. I'll tell you that the Syrian civil war was preceded by the worst drought in its instrumental record, and rural to urban migration rates were 4 to 5 times faster than normal. It's impossible to prove that that caused the Syrian civil war, but it certainly was an environmental stressor that correlated right before the war erupted. Every one of these pathways, and notice climate change has multiple exposure pathways through which it affects our health, and it's why it's such a daunting challenge. It's not a single agent of disease or a single exposure, multiple pathways through which we are affected, and each one of these pathways has health consequences, as you can see listed there. One example, right before the big Zika epidemic in Brazil and Colombia and throughout the Caribbean region, right before that happened, and it was also a record year for dengue fever, those diseases are both carried by Aedes aegypti mosquito. And right before this happened, we had the strongest El Nino in recent history in this winter of 2015. And knowing how climate affects the transmission of these viruses from that mosquito, I want to show you that the vectorial capacity was the highest that it had been in 60 years. A lot of that was related to climatic conditions, even though the virus got there from international travel, and it's a very complicated story. But the vectorial capacity for transmission of Zika and dengue was the highest it had been in 60 years. But a quick reminder, climate change, it's not just about warming, it's about extremes of the water cycle. And in the future, what the projections are is that when it rains, it will pour because hot air holds more moisture. And already we have trouble with our water systems from contamination of stormwater. We conducted a study for this city, Chicago, looking at the watersheds that affect Chicago, and because of the intensity of heavy rainfall in the future, Chicago may see a doubling in the number of combined sewage overflow events that threaten the safety of drinking water. So this report that Keith showed briefly, the United Nations, after the Paris Agreement, asked the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to conduct a report to say, what would it take to level our warming at 1.5 degrees centigrade? And the sad news is that to do that, we would have to cut our fossil fuel emissions, burning fossil fuels, we'd have to cut that 45% in the next 11 years and get to net zero by 2050. That's really fast. But this is where we come in, because climate change solutions offer unbelievable opportunities for public health. for global health. Look at the energy sector. Because of air pollution, 7 million people die prematurely because of air pollution. Transportation, because of sedentary lifestyles around the world, more than 5 million people die every year. And then a third big sector that I don't have time to talk about, food systems, getting to eating lower on the food chain and reducing meat in the diet has environmental benefits and, of course, health benefits. So when I talk to policymakers, I ask them this question. If it costs about $30 to invest in cleaner energy to avoid emitting 1 ton of CO2, what else happens when we burn coal that causes greenhouse gases? CO2 is the most abundant. We get the nasty particles, PM 2.5, and other hazardous agents that Phil Landrigan will talk more about, pollution, that harms people every year, all the time, immediately. Okay, so when you burn coal, you create nasty pollution today and greenhouse gases as well that affect the future. But when you don't burn that coal and you don't emit 1 ton of CO2, all the other pollutants that you don't emit has a huge benefit. And when you compare this health benefit of $200 in avoided mortality, hospitalization, and lost work days, you compare that $200 versus the $30 investment, which number is bigger? And the policymakers are only thinking about the 30 and not about the major health benefit, the $200. And it'll be even bigger in polluted countries in South Asia and other places. That benefit is even higher. And the $30 might be that might be an overestimate. But look at the price of solar. It's dropped 99% in the last few decades. And finally, thinking about transportation sector, compare places like Washington, D.C. with Wisconsin and Alabama. In Washington, they are #1 for leaving their car behind when they go to work, #1 for using mass transit, #1 for walking to work, #1 for biking to work. They're #3 in fitness and no obesity. I think they would be 1 if they weren't so stressed out in Washington. Compared to Alabama, which ranks dead last for each of these and has a terrible problem with obesity, and Wisconsin is somewhere in between. So these are interrelated. So I conclude my presentation by asking this question that, regardless of one's views on climate change science, we can all support clean air for low carbon energy, safe routes to school, physically fit children and adults from cities designed for people, not just for cars, and green jobs, lots of them. So, in conclusion, climate change absolutely is a health crisis, and solutions to climate change offer enormous health opportunities. And as trusted messengers in the health field, we need to talk about climate change. And you can help, you can take this message. I've done a version of this on TEDx, and you can Google my name and TEDx and send this to all your friends and colleagues to get the message. Thank you very much.
Well, first off, thank you to CUGH for allowing this platform for all of us to disseminate our message. And secondly, it's an honor and privilege to be with such a distinguished panel whose work and leadership I've long admired. So I'm going to talk to you today, during the short amount of time that we have together, about 2 stories. The story of the Lancet Countdown, and then I'd like to engage in your story, the best I can up here from this stage, about how you can be part of the solution to climate change. So story 1 is about the Lancet Countdown. So the Lancet Commission released 2 reports, the first in 2009, describing sort of famously that climate change is the biggest global health opportunity, or biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And then 6 years later, it reframed it as the biggest opportunity. However, they recognized that this in itself was not enough. So they committed to tracking progress on climate change and health through the year 2030. They created 5 domains or working groups, and these included impacts, exposures, and vulnerabilities, adaptation planning and resilience, mitigation actions and health co-benefits, again echoing what Dr. Patz highlighted in regards to that, making that intimate connection, finance and economics, and then public and political engagement. So Nicholas Watts, who's the executive director of the Lancet Countdown in the UK, shared that as they put together the first report in 2017, they clearly saw that the solutions for climate change are not only available, but they are feasible and that they're cost effective. But what was lacking was political will, hence the 5th domain. So they've created these indicators over these 5 working groups, and the goal is to illuminate the hidden human health cost of climate change, but also to hold us accountable and track on how we're doing on implementing the solutions. And so there's 27 institutions, every continent is represented, and they truly embraced the concept that a multidisciplinary approach is required for us to tackle this unprecedented challenge. So they have mathematicians, political scientists, climate scientists, public health experts. But remember again about the political will piece. And so they want these indicators to directly translate to policy. And as we know, all politics are local. And so they developed country briefs. And in 2018, there were 11 overall, including MSF. And that's how I became involved with the Lancet Countdown process as I led the creation of the United States brief. So the 2018 global report, I sort of break it down in my mind around that threat and opportunity dichotomy that was outlined in the initial commission reports. Now, Dr. Patz has laid out the threats, and the only one I'm going to highlight from the 2018 global report here is one that keeps me up at night. And that's that climate change has the potential to disrupt core public health infrastructure and overwhelm health services. Thus, climate change has the potential to undermine the advances that we have made in global health over the past 50 years. Now, this document is not meant to sit on a shelf and gather dust. This data and the solutions within it are meant to live out through you. And thus, I want to engage you and hope that you will weave these solutions into your work, which leads me to story number 2, you. So we know that climate change disproportionately impacts those which contributed the least to the problem. And we stand at a historic point in history where we see climate change and the impacts around us. So thus, instead of these pictures up here behind me, I would like you to replace those images with pictures of your patients and pictures of people from the populations and communities that you work with, because those are the faces of climate change. And thus, I make an argument that all of us in this room today are experts in climate change and health. So thus, as fellow experts, I'd like to highlight 6 different opportunities that are outlined within the Lancet Countdown 2018 Global Report. And I divide them out into sort of 3 categories: understand, invest, and connect. So to begin with, understand. So one of the indicators surveyed nearly 500 global cities and found that 65% of them had done risk assessments about climate change. Now, we know that climate change impacts regions differently, and thus we have to understand it on a local level. The global health community and those of us in this room are very good at assessments, both before, during, and after interventions. And I make a plea that climate change has to be incorporated into the framework of these assessments. Another indicator tracks the publications around climate change and health and climate change and public health. And as you'll see in these lines, there's been a steady rise, but we need to have a stark inflection point beginning today. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to reframe your entire research infrastructure. It means adding climate change as a lens to your existing work, and it can be as simple as including climate change into your discussion of a paper. It helps make those connections that already exist between climate change and health. Invest. In blue, the total adaptation dollars spent around climate change is outlined. However, these figures fall far short of the commitments laid out in the Paris Agreement. And unfortunately, as you see, they've actually been falling since 2013. Now, there's actually a second category on this slide. In gray is the total health adaptation spending. I can see some of you squinting, trying to see if you can see it. The fact that you can't is no mistake. It barely raises above the baseline on this slide. Another indicator looks to see how the financing of climate resilient health systems around health and health-related spending. And health-related is defined as including agriculture and disaster response. And it lays it out with low-income countries on the left, high-income countries on the right. And independent of whatever measurement indicator you use, you'll see that there is a stark lack of color and less lack of financing in the low and lower-income countries. So I make a plea that any capacity building around health systems has to include climate change. Lastly, connect. This indicator looks to see the proportion of countries that make the connection between climate change and health at the UN General Assembly. You'll see that they talk about health in blue, climate change in green, but in red is them making those connections between climate change and health. And there's been a rise, but as you'll see, it's actually been on the decline in recent years. So as we all engage with leaders of countries, we have to help them understand those connections between climate change and health so they can disseminate that to the world. Lastly is media coverage. We know we need to engage the public and help them understand the connections between climate change and health. And media and reporters can be powerful partners in doing this. So there's been a rise over the past decade of about 42% with articles linking climate change and health. But Southeast Asia in blue has been largely driving this, as well as the other regions have been fairly stable. So I make a plea that next time you talk to a reporter, help them see that understanding of climate change and health, and help them increase their coverage. So I've laid out just 6 examples that exist within this document. And I challenge you to find at least one that you can implement. And I leave you with this quote from the 2018 Global Report. Ensuring a widespread understanding of climate change as a central public health issue will be crucial in delivering an accelerated response, with the health profession beginning to rise to this challenge. So we have a profound responsibility, not only as citizens, but especially as health professionals. Our action or inaction around climate change is going to directly affect the health of nations for centuries to come. The voice of this global health community is enormously powerful. And if this voice can amplify that connection between climate and health, I truly believe that it can accelerate the momentum to reach that tipping point of action. So while I've shared 2 stories, again, one of them is yours. The ending of my story, of your story, the story of our patients, the story of our populations, the story of climate change, and the story of our planet, the ending is unwritten. But I hope that together we can write an ending that prioritizes health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee, for your statistics, and particularly for your statistics about Africa. I'm here to talk to you today about Africa and the environmental issues in Africa. I thank all of you for being present and for the invitation to share 10 minutes with you. A fact, and this is a fact because it's based on scientific evidence. Africa's population will likely increase to 2.4 billion by the year 2050. I think many of you will remember the year 2000 and how we thought everything was going to stop and our computers would explode in our hands. And now 30 years later, it's about 20 years later, it doesn't look like it was such a long time, the past 20 years. 2050 is going to arrive at our doorstep one morning with the mail, and we'll be very surprised that there'll be 2.4 billion Africans on the planet. So what does that mean for the environment? I put up here a word cloud where we're sitting down as a group of people trying to figure out what are our most pressing needs? What will be the most pressing needs on the continent? So the big words are the ones that were mentioned many times. Urbanization. In Africa, when you talk about urbanization, you're not really thinking about the development of new cities which are planned and skyscrapers and road infrastructure. You're actually thinking more of urban hubs that expand without infrastructure. So the issue of urban sprawl comes up. And then when you think of a growing African city, in every country that you go to, the capital cities have traffic jams, air pollution, lack of housing, a lot of poverty surrounding them. In order to create the space for these cities, there's a lot of degradation of the environment, cutting down of trees, using up of resources, taking them out of the ground and carrying them out away to other countries, depletion of the natural resources. So in that word cloud, what we can say is a fact is that the population is going to increase and increase quite significantly over the next 30 years. In orange are some sort of solutions. So I'd like to just give an example and talk through two issues. One is the issues of policies and governance, and the other is the role of science in all of this. Kenyans use an estimated 100 million plastic bags a year. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that in 2017, March 2017, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources issued a ban on plastic bags. It was called the toughest ban enforced in the world. The fine for production of plastic bags is up to $19,000 to $38,000 or a 4-year jail term. And colleagues, this ban is serious. If I go shopping here in the United States and show up at the airport with a lovely Macy's bag, I could be carted away. Now, this is not new. Kenya started to try to ban plastic bags in 2008, 2011. The problem was actually enforcing that ban. So in 2017, it was made a law by the Cabinet Secretary. A similar one a ban was placed on plastics in 2008 in Kigali. Again, this was a declaration, and there's just no plastic bags in Kigali anymore. So we all look at these and think these are great laws, and indeed we've seen the benefits in the environment and in our country where wildlife is a serious part of the tourism industry. We see the benefits. The wildlife are not eating plastic and the bags are not blowing around. The ban has been effected, and these landfills, they don't look like this anymore. But have the landfills gone? So people are carrying their shopping in something else, and what's happening to those shopping bags? Are they biodegradable? Are they really reusable? I see a lot of bags that are reusable in the sense that you can use them 3 or 4 times, and then what happens to them? So there's a discussion this morning about how laws are made, environmental laws are made on the continent. About 33 years ago, a group of African scientists got together and established the African Academy of Sciences. This was in recognition of a gap that was seen in policy on the continent where scientists were not in that policy space. And these are talking about scientists in all fields of science. So 33 years ago, a group of mostly elderly men sat together and established the African Academy of Sciences to look at the most pressing needs for the continent and discuss how to bring together the best minds on the continent to address African issues using African data and actually advocating for the continent in a way that it addresses a serious sustainable development. Central to that discussion was a discussion on the environment for research and development on the continent. We found that many of our scientists were not leaders in the continent. They were working in other nations. They were actually working off the continent. And the environment for science was really unhealthy. There was very little space for education beyond the undergraduate level, and certainly not much opportunities for postdoctoral research. There was a missing innovation and science entrepreneurial culture, and there were certain critical gaps also in the research landscape. So the academy has grown since then to an academy that recognizes the top in science and uses the top in science to provide a think tank function for the continent. Now, the think tank works in different strategic focus areas, covering health, the environment and climate, social science and humanities, just basic natural sciences, and very importantly, in policy and governance. Within the academy, there are 4 pillars of the theory of change, and under these, major programs. First is building the research and development and leadership infrastructure, cultivating the innovation and science, developing scientists in their early and mid-career so that they are in the space of addressing Africa's most pressing needs, and filling critical gaps in the ecosystem. For example, in things like STEM and advocacy, public engagement in science, really being able to advise lawmakers, policymakers, handling money well, good financial grant practice, and also research systems management. Now, to go through some of the programs that are there, I won't go through all of them one by one, but as you can see, within each of those categories, there are several types of programs that the Academy runs. I'd like to focus a little bit on filling the critical gaps because this has been very important in actually growing the ecosystem for research and development. One of the things that is a real problem is that very few institutions, particularly universities across the continent, have good support within their infrastructure to support scientists develop their career, and particularly to support them develop their career and remain on the continent. We've talked a long time, and you all heard about the brain drain, and then the fact that once you've moved to another continent, there's a true reluctance to come back, not for a lack of wanting to, but because a lack of career development pathways and places to work on your return. Again, there's also a lack of scientists who advise government. Most countries on the continent do not even have a government scientist located accessible for policy making. So the Academy has looked at all of these areas and put programs in place to address each one of them. Now, there's a big funding platform known as ISA, Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa, with a portfolio exceeding $200 million in 2018. It may seem like a good amount of money, but it really is still a drop in the ocean. We've seen from our work and our calls for certain areas of science, mostly related to policy, implementation, and translation, that there is a massive appetite for scientists to work in different areas of need on the continent, including climate and the environment. I'll give an example. For one of our latest calls, had about 2,000 applicants for a fellowship program that was going to just issue 30 places. So that is the level of the call, and that is how much, that is sort of an indication of how many Africans are truly interested in working on the continent. For all of our programs, the scientists must commit to work here on the continent and collaborate with other African scientists. The coverage of these programs is quite extensive in sub-Saharan Africa. The Academy has a Pan-African mandate, and we are working on extending this mandate also to North Africa. Now, a key aspect of what we are doing, namely shifting the center of gravity of research on Africa onto the continent, is being able to set the agenda and priority for the most pressing needs that we have. Now, in order to do this, we align with national, African, and global goals for climate, for the environment, and for all things science. And then we fund only what is agreed as a priority. So today, when we're thinking about the environment, what would we see as Africa's most pressing needs? The ban on plastics, on plastic bags, is an indication of what currently happens in the policy realm. Making policies without the consultation of science, without the support of science. And it's not because the policymakers do not want to have the support of science. There is just a gap there. If you allow me to go back to my first slide, in red and crossed out there, perhaps, there has been a ban on plastics. Oh, we've got right to the beginning again. Let me just go back again. The plastic ban is enforced. There's still many other things that still have not been addressed by that. There are also things that weren't on my first slide. All of the things that are not in green highlight are on the radar of governments. Things like what's happening with our oceans, what's happening with the ozone layer depletion, and indeed, even global warming, perhaps, is not a discussion except in terms of adaptation. African scientists are only now beginning to be within the discussions at the Conference of Parties, taking a leading role and looking at African data for assessments and writing the assessments for predictions and so on and so forth. So this morning, I'd just like to say that this is something that the Academy is doing. And for us, one of our biggest solutions is addressing the need for science. So out of this word cloud, I think there's a lot for the scientists to be involved in. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I'd also like to celebrate International Women's Day and hopefully have a slide. Yes, let's clap while we wait for the slide. I could probably do it without the slides, but I'd like to just honor, for my honoree today, Dr. Patricia Conrad. And Pat has been a role model for me throughout my career. She is a board member for CUGH. She's a National Academy member. But when I started my training, she was a brand new assistant professor. And she was the most encouraging person in science for me as a woman in my career. And I know when we sit in these places, maybe students are here today, when I was going through, there weren't a lot of women role models, and Pat taught me that I could be an excellent scientist and a mother, should you want to be one, and then even a leader. And I certainly didn't believe her in that, but I thank you, Pat, for just making my career happen. Back to depressing things. We are, as Keith introduced, in the most devastating decline of species, the most severe extinction crisis since the dinosaurs disappeared from this earth. And all of my colleagues have done a wonderful job explaining some of the drivers that have caused that to be. I want to share with you what animals mean to the planet, and to take that to another level and say those things, losing those species because of some of these drivers, especially climate change, human population growth, we're going to hear about pollution, also causes another driver, because that loss of biodiversity then threatens everything, our health, our food supply. I also think that sometimes when we talk about these concepts, it's very difficult to make it personal. When we go back to our university laboratories and we say, well, I learned a lot, but what am I supposed to do about that back at home? How am I supposed to make an impact? Now, many of you, I know, interact at the policy level, and certainly the fastest, broadest, most impactful change can be at that level. But without what the rest of you are doing for science, we can't have that well-informed policy. And the impact that you can have on your trainees, as Pat has had on me, has that same amplifying effect, because you have the ability to train that next generation of leaders. So I'm going to try to take my talk a little bit into a place that's very personal. And Keith also outed me at this Global Health Conference as a veterinarian, but I'm very proud of that. And I decided after veterinary school to train in epidemiology and ecology because I wanted to save species. I wasn't really thinking about the one that I belonged in at that time. I was thinking about some of these gorgeous ones, you know, the charismatic ones, and I worked a lot on those species. And it is pollution, like we're seeing here, and all of these other drivers that's really causing us to now question, is it good enough for people like me who started their career in this realm? Can we make a difference going one species at a time? Are we making some tough decisions about allowing which species we should just let go extinct because there aren't enough resources and the attention of the world gets pulled away for other incredibly important things like outbreaks and things that need the resources that could be going to saving species, but is that short-sighted, as Dr. Patz said? Are we missing that big dollar figure that predicts our health when we go slowly and in an emergency kind of responsive way for those immediate problems that we see right in front of us? So the question is, can the animals adapt fast enough to overcome the challenges that are facing them, the drivers for these changes? Again, making it personal, I work and have worked in the marine ecosystem, and a few years ago was able to work on a project where we actually saw a direct impact of climate change. We saw that as the polar ice cap shrunk, it allowed migration of species from the Atlantic Ocean, the North Sea, into the Pacific Ocean, and with them, they brought new pathogens to species that hadn't experienced them. This is not a new concept, but it was linking the actual decrease of the ice flow to this distribution of pathogens around the world. Now, humans, we don't need that. We travel around and take care of that really well on our own, but I know many of you flew here, I did, right? So we change that and we make that very rapid. And so it's a little bit harder for us to make that direct connection between climate and change. But again, our animal species can be that canary in the coal mine for the importance of this kind of change. Can we change fast enough? If the animals are going extinct, are we next if we're not careful? And I really appreciate the inclusion of the fire in the slides. I come from California, and when we think about climate refugees, we are often thinking about the low and middle income countries. I can tell you California is not in that range. But we have climate refugees from our wildfires right now. So we're experiencing that here in our country, and yet it is still the people in the lowest income brackets that are most severely impacted. They have to move to be able to grow crops and work in areas in agriculture that they have lived their whole lives in a certain area and now have to move to new areas. There's no housing for them. They're less likely to have insurance to be able to respond and take care of their families. So this is a tragedy that we used to maybe be able to put in a box, or our policymakers might have been able to say that's somewhere else we're doing well, but we can't say that anymore. Can we change fast enough? Well, we sure can, because we can prove to ourselves we can change fast for the other direction in things that maybe aren't so hopeful for all of these drivers that we're talking about today. We can make mega farms, and we can increase our animal food production to match our desire when we have high income situations. Should we? Probably not, but are we willing to change in the other direction? And even in areas, this is in Cambodia, that may not be in that high income bracket, we still see the possibility of the influence of vehicles and cell phones and all of the things that we're doing, again, that we heard aren't so healthy for us, but they're enabling practices that maybe used to say very rurally, like these rodents that are on the back of this motorcycle, getting into the urban areas for food because people prefer them, because people used to eat them when they lived rurally, and now everyone is moving to the cities. Now, is that a problem? Well, it is for the rodents, but is it a problem for us, for global health? Certainly, as we're thinking about what to do next, how we approach behavior change and how we think about what kinds of things come with those rodents, like the pathogens that they might be carrying, and we bring them into high populated areas and we let them mix with other rodents that they may not have seen in evolutionary history. We make for the opportunity of disease transmission, spillover to people, amplification, and spread. There are some species we can't lose because we need them for our food supply. And most of you are very, very well aware of the dramatic extinctions going on in the insect world and the crises with our pollinators like honeybees. But maybe there is also a lesson there that we can learn. We heard some wonderful talks yesterday about insect-based food, but we have to figure out the palatability of that. We have to figure out who's going to eat those insects if we're all going to survive on this planet. And we can switch, and we can think about aquaculture. But as we think about new forms of agriculture, we also need to be careful about unintended consequences. We can't just keep making the same mistakes that we've made as a race in the past. Sorry. And this, again, a bit more personal to me. I now work in these interfaces where animals and people are coming together in ways that we don't think about really here in Chicago. But people are coming together making pizzas with the monkeys, right? So this is a reality, and these communities are connected to you by sometimes only one plane flight, less than a 24-hour or 48-hour cycle to get a pathogen that might spill over into that food supply into yours here. We're also impacting the world with our domestic animals and our pets, not only our food animals, and they're interacting in urban environments. we're seeing some species, the individual numbers in species, jump up. Certainly those animals we like to have around us, but also other species that can adapt to us quite well, especially in urban environments. And there's where we really need to be watching for the potential for new evolution of viruses and other things of pandemic potential. Just a little word about farm to fork. I'm going to let you tell the story that riffs on that. But if we look at this farm, it's a nice farm. Looks like it's good salad. The top piece of that farm is a bat attractor, so that you can pull bats in to defecate on your farm to fertilize that farm. Now, these kinds of new agricultural methods put us at risk because we know many coronaviruses, bats are the evolutionary host of coronaviruses that we're seeing. And when we see an epidemic or a large-scale epidemic out of viruses like this, it usually costs us on the order of $40 billion to respond globally. So it's not just the lives lost and the risks that we say we continue to spread, but it is also the economics, the global economies that we need to think about. So we really need to change the way we think about these things. And again, this is something that you can do. You can think more holistically. You can work transdisciplinarily. You can bring teams together that think about the economics, but that also think about virus evolution if you're worried about pandemics, but understand the animal ecology. Without doing that, I'm afraid our slow process of working on our own in our own laboratories is not going to match the speed at which the Earth is changing, and that is a threat to our health and our population. So, what can we do? Well, the Global Health Security Agenda was mentioned. It was born in 2014, and it kind of followed on from the international health regulations. And most of the world's countries has signed on to the IHR, the International Health Regulations, for reporting and responding to diseases. But by 2012, it was recognized that only about 16% of the countries in the world really had the capacity to respond. And so now the Global Health Security Agenda is helping to address that. It is, there are over 64 nations participating, as well as the international organizations. And I listed here the US agencies that are taking a leadership role. I think you also heard a little bit from Keith about the joint external evaluation process, where we call JEE, where many of these countries are signing on, stepping forward and saying, we're not just going to stay behind our country borders and say we're doing fine. We're going to evaluate ourselves, and we're going to set ourselves goals to be able to move forward, because we are in need and we are part of this global population. So the Global Health Security Agenda recognizes 3 big risks. It's really thinking about emerging infectious diseases, including antimicrobial resistance, and the unintended consequences for those of us who might discover viruses, but that others might take those and create risks by fabricating these organisms or adjusting them to be more easily delivered. It's looking at those opportunities, as my colleague was focusing on, in the public health frameworks, lab and surveillance tools, and outbreak control. And it is also focusing on those priorities to prevent, detect, and respond. I bring it to you as a potential solution where, again, you can contribute, because it is one of the few really large-scale efforts where it is designed to be transdisciplinary. It is thinking from the beginning to bring all these different disciplines together. And I think there are some that aren't here as strongly as they should be. And I know that we need even more on the face of social sciences than we have been looking at in the past. And it is a huge deficit, both from a training perspective for a pipeline and for our sort of health worker kind of mind frame to bring people into our fold. So I'll just leave you with a couple of things that I think that we can all do. We can all walk more softly on the earth. We can consider our personal choices, but I think we have to come together to advocate for that in a larger way, because it is at the policy level where we can make those things happen. And I believe in our research, when we're designing our projects, when we're implementing our projects, when we're communicating the results, we have to be thinking about these transdisciplinary approaches. You can do that both in your research and in your teaching. I know our students are crying out for it. I'm sure yours are too. And that is certainly an area where you have the control and you can make a difference that will amplify your effect way beyond your dreams, probably, for your career. We also need to think about unintended consequences. For me, working on bats that might have viruses that spill over into people, I have to think about saying, hey, don't do that. Don't put that farm right over agriculture, because what are those people supposed to do for their economic livelihoods? We have to be pulling together the other groups that we don't always think about into our plans. Again, the sociologists, the behavior change experts, so that we can work with communities, engage with communities at all levels. So you are used to working with the communities probably that you have at your university, perhaps if you're working in the field, some of you with policymakers, but not all of us engage directly with the communities who are affected. And I think that is critically, critically important, because if behavior change and policies are presented that are not palatable to them, they will not be accepted and they will not be implemented. Then I just want to encourage you one more time to think and act both globally and locally. You're here, so you definitely think globally. I know you act locally. I want you to act globally too. I want to flip that saying and say you have the power to act globally because you are the experts in the world, and more importantly, you're training the next generation of experts for this world to save this planet.
Good afternoon. So I gave a lot of thought to which woman I should honor this afternoon. And I reflected on a saying that we hear a lot in public health, that our most grateful patients are people whom we will never meet. So I'd like to reverse that and say that I would like to honor all of the women in public health now and in times past who have brought us to this point. The women who run vaccine programs, the nurses who run public health programs, the engineers that built clean water systems and designed sewer systems, so that we now live twice as long as our ancestors did just a century ago. A shout out to the women of public health. So, to wrap up this session, my job is to talk about pollution, and specifically to talk about how to reduce the burden of disease, the environmental devastation that results from pollution. So what is pollution? Pollution is material introduced into the environment by human activity. That's important, human activity that causes harm to people, harm to ecosystems. The United States is not terribly polluted today. We still have chemical pollution. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. We've cleaned up a lot of the worst forms of our pollution in the US, in Canada, in Western Europe, in Australia, Japan. But this picture here is Cleveland, Ohio, just 50 years ago. This is the kind of air that we used to have in the city. Cleveland was also the city that was infamous for the fact that the Cuyahoga River caught fire because there were so many pollutants in it. We used to have terrible pollution in this country and in other developed countries. And the fact that we have relatively clean air today relatively clean water is attributed to the fact that we know how to do it, we've developed the technology, and that's really the theme of my talk this afternoon. So pollution and climate change are very, very tightly tied to each other. Combustion is the principal source of both of them, and anything that fixes the one is going to fix the other. The two go hand in hand at every level. They're both products of what has been termed the the extract, use, dispose society in which we're now in, what Pope Francis has called the throwaway culture, a linear approach to using the Earth's resources, an approach that pretends that the planetary resources are inexhaustible and that we have no responsibility for the future. That's an obsolete notion, and we've got to change it. The fact that all of you, all of us are here today is testament to the fact that there are certainly good people, far-sighted people in the world who want to behave differently. So, a year ago, we released the report of the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. I'm happy to note that Keith Martin was one of our commissioners. And this was the main finding of the Lancet report, that pollution is responsible each year for 9 million deaths around the world. 9 million. Think about that figure. That's three times more than AIDS, malaria, and TB put together. It's 1 1/3 times more than tobacco. Tobacco kills 7 million people per year. It's 10 times more deaths than wars and terrorism and all forms of violence. It's a big problem. It's been a neglected problem. It's been under the radar. It hasn't gotten the resource that it demands for it to be corrected. And it's a problem that we did our best in the Lancet Commission to present, to lay out the magnitude of the problem and present a roadmap for the future. So just a few snapshots: household air pollution, polluted water, lead poisoning. There should have been a slide of ambient air pollution that I guess I forgot to put in there. Patterns of pollution are changing around the world. You see two crossing lines here. The orange line coming down are the number of deaths around the world from 1990 to the present from household air pollution and from water pollution combined, the two forms of pollution that our Lancet Commission called the traditional forms of pollution, the forms of pollution that have been with humankind for thousands of years. And those are going down. They're going down because WHO, NGOs, the Global Alliance on Clean Cook Stoves, national health authorities around the world have taken the responsibility of bringing clean water to more and more people and taken the responsibility for getting rid of old cook stoves. But at the same time, the blue line, ambient air pollution, outdoor air pollution, and chemical pollution are going up. They're going up steadily, and in the 2 years that have elapsed since we closed out this particular graph, they've gone up still further. Deaths from ambient air pollution are credibly predicted to double by the year 2050 if we do not take aggressive interventive action. Chemical pollution, way below the radar, inadequately counted in calculations of the global burden of disease because many of the chemicals in wide use have never been tested for toxicity. We don't even know what they do, and yet they're widely out there, and they're extensively in people, and the production continues to go up and up and up. Doubling time for global chemical production right now is about 25 to 30 years. More than 2/3 of chemical production is taking place in the countries of the world that are least equipped to deal with it. All you have to do is think about the explosion in 1984 in Bhopal, or think about the fact that 2 million tons of new asbestos are pouring today in 2019 into the world's poorest countries. And by the way, those of you who are U.S. citizens will be proud and pleased to note that the biggest Russian asbestos company called Ural Asbestos has for the past year been displaying the photograph of Donald Trump on their bales of asbestos in recognition of Donald Trump's decision not to ban asbestos in this country. A big shout out for Ural Asbestos for calling it like it is. Pollution's a big cause of NCDs, non-communicable diseases. 70% of the diseases caused by pollution are NCDs, and here are some specific figures. 22% of all cardiac deaths, a quarter of all stroke deaths, half of deaths from COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 40% of lung cancer deaths. These are big numbers, and yet inexplicably, the World Health Organization's global plan for the prevention and the control of non-communicable diseases barely mentions pollution and certainly has no targets addressing pollution. This is something that clearly has to change. NCDs is more than smoking, alcohol, tobacco, and obesity. The impact of pollution on NCD mortality is especially striking in low and middle income countries. So this is a bit of a complex graph, but it's worth taking a minute to work through. It divides the countries of the world into 4 quartiles: high, upper middle, lower middle, and low, World Bank classifications. In each of those quartiles, the number of deaths caused by pollution is the red bar. So you can see in high-income countries such as the United States, pollution is not a big deal. It only kills 100,000 people per year. It's overshadowed by tobacco and elevated BMI, obesity. But in the upper middle income countries, that would be China, Mexico, Brazil, pollution is number 2, exceeded only by tobacco. And when you go below that, lower middle and lower, pollution is far and away the leading cause of death from NCD. So if the global attack on NCDs is going to succeed, it can no longer afford to ignore pollution. Pollution is a big cause of premature death, disability in the world's poorest countries. And this graph just underscores that in a different way, showing that 92% of pollution-related deaths occur in low and middle income countries. The darker the shade of red, the higher the proportion of all deaths in a particular country due to pollution. You can see in some of the hardest hit countries, pollution is responsible for more than 1 death in 4. That's extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. One of the things we did on the Lancet Commission, which I think was important, was we brought in economists. We brought in economists because we wanted to be able to tell ministers of finance and tell heads of state that not only is pollution killing their people, but it's also undercutting their ability to develop their countries, to develop their cities, to lift themselves out of poverty. And so we calculated that pollution, first of all, has big healthcare costs, which is 1.5% of the healthcare budget in a country such as ours, but 7% of the healthcare budget in a rapidly growing country like Sri Lanka, where we got the best data. And then in addition to the healthcare costs, pollution causes productivity losses, the losses that result when a healthy adult is taken out of the workforce by illness or by premature death, and their environmental costs. And all of these can undercut development. So that's the bad news. But the good news now, the opportunity, Keith specifically instructed me to talk about opportunity. What can we do about this? This is not a hand-wringing session. This is a session intended to point the way forward. And I think the proof of principle, I've said it already, that we can prevent pollution is the fact that the rich countries of the world have already gone a long, long way towards preventing their worst form of pollution. I'm not saying it's perfect here. It's not. Chemical pollution is a huge and unrecognized problem. But nonetheless, we put strategies in place that are based on science, supported by policy and regulation, and backed up by regulation that make things happen. In this country, not always, not entirely equitably, nonetheless, more often than not, polluters have to pay. And when polluters have to pay, they realize they can no longer use the air and the water and the land as a public dumping ground. They change their ways, they change their practices, they change their processes. They stop producing as much waste. And the Lancet Commission concluded that these solutions that have been worked out for more than a half century in the high-income countries of the world are ready today to be taken to global scale and applied in countries at every level of income. It's also very cost-effective. Before their website was shut down, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency did a calculation, and they found that every dollar invested in pollution control, air pollution control, since we passed the Clean Air Act in this country in 1970, has saved $30, most of that in averted healthcare costs. And again, a second example, when we took lead out of gasoline in this country, a success story that's been replicated now in many, many countries around the world, we dropped the blood lead level of American children by 90%. We increased the IQ of every child born since 1980 by about 5 IQ points. And those two generations of more intelligent children, which is most of you, have returned billions of dollars to the American economy because you're smarter and therefore inevitably more productive. And here's a graph that John Samet, Tom Burke, and Bernie Goldstein published a couple of years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. The green line there at the top shows the gross domestic product in the United States, the GDP, which has grown by 250% since we passed the Clean Air Act in 1970. And the bottom line, sort of grayish line tending downwards, is the levels of air pollution, which are down in the aggregate by 70% in this country since we started tracking them nationally. Anybody who tells you that controlling pollution is going to kill the economy, send the jobs to Mexico, is dealing in fake news. So what's the way forward? 4 specific points. Number 1, pollution has to come out of the closet. It can no longer be neglected. It has to be addressed. It has to be a priority. When cities and countries are developing their plans for economic development for the next 5 years or the next 10 years, they need to think about pollution as they make those plans and bake into those strategies targets for reducing pollution. China has done that. In their most recent 5-year plan, China has set targets to reduce air pollution, water pollution, and soil pollution. That's a model for the world. Other countries need to do it, countries at every level of income. Secondly, we need data. The fundamental basis for all public health is numbers. We couldn't eradicate smallpox until we knew how many cases there were and where they were occurring. The veterinarians could not eradicate rinderpest in animals, in cattle, until they knew where the cases were, they could target them. It's all about data. The reason we know we have measles outbreaks in the United States today is because the state health departments and CDC are collecting the data. But when you look around the world and you look at most of the countries in the world, there are no data on even the most basic levels of pollution. PM 2.5 air pollution is the poster child. And so one of the immediate, most urgent needs is a global, low-cost pollution monitoring system. When Gina McCarty was head of US EPA, she put a single pollution monitor on the roof of the United States Embassy in Beijing, and she publicized the numbers, showing that the levels of air pollution, that the numbers were far higher than the government of China was putting out. That immediately ignited civil society in China, kids starting getting air pollution monitors on their watches. Everybody in Beijing became aware that pollution was out of control, and what happened, pollution was controlled. Things need to be enforced, and finally, we need to monitor progress. We need to create a global observatory on pollution and health. I'm happy to report that 8 months ago, the Global Observatory on Pollution and Health was launched at Boston College. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a spectacular panel, isn't it? Give them a hand, ladies and gentlemen. We started 5 minutes late, and we just really wanted to give folks a chance to ask a question. So maybe we'll take just 3 questions, we'll bundle them, and we'll have a chance for the panel to respond. So whoever gets to the mics first 3 people, those will be the questions. So and then I'll bundle them together, or we'll get these two. So it'll just be both of you, and I'll bundle the questions. So if you could introduce yourself and ask your question, please, and I'll go to you.
Hi, my name is Maura Walsh. I'm a third-year medical student. So my question has to do with the waste that we actually produce within the healthcare system. I feel that I've noticed that, in these huge hospitals that I've been rotating at, obviously they take a lot of energy to power and are often very wasteful. Things I feel are thrown away at high rates. So I'm wondering if you guys know about any hospital systems that do a better job at this, that are more green, and things that we can maybe do, actions we can take at our home institutions to improve them.
Great, thanks, Mara. And we'll have you, and then you, and that'll be it, I'm afraid. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful talk, very enlightening. My name is Varun Shetty, I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm a critical care medicine fellow. My question is, that in addition to the solutions that we provided, it seems like the problem is lack of resources. We don't have enough land, we don't have enough food, we don't have enough water, that we're always trying to maximize production to meet this growing demand, which is population. We also know that advocating for women to have access to family planning and to make an informed choice about population control also leads to better personal and societal outcomes. My question is, why is population control and advocating for family planning included in our plan for health that is associated with climate change and pollution?
Thank you very much. And this is the last one.
Christiana Kaufman from Wayne State in Detroit. In terms of economics, shipping from the east to the west, those big tankers that burn 100,000 gallons of oil per mile, how do we address that in terms of the economics as well?
Thank you very much. 3 excellent questions. So first question was reducing health waste in health systems. The second one is how do we do a better job of integrating family planning access into our work? And the third question was how do we reduce the cost of actually oceanic shipping, making that more efficient. Who wants to take one each? Phil, you want to take one?
I can say something about hospitals and the healthcare industry. So Emily Sene, who was a colleague of mine at Mount Sinai Medical School in my time there, did an analysis that published about 6 months ago in JAMA Online, where she looked at how the healthcare industry is stacking up vis-a-vis other sectors of the American economy in dealing with these issues. And can I have some water? The bottom line is that the healthcare sector is doing a very poor job. They have not stepped up. The healthcare industry accounts for something like 15% of the American economy. It should be, because it's such a big sector, it should have a major systematized effort to reduce its carbon footprint, to reduce the amount of waste it generates, to increase recycling, to diminish energy. And it's going on spotty. There's a few healthcare systems. I think Kaiser Permanente is a leader across the country. And there are a few others. Gunderson in Wisconsin is a big leader. But most healthcare systems are way behind the mark. 80% of the Fortune 500 companies in this country, 85%, produce each year what's called a corporate sustainability report. They may not be completely honest, but at least they set targets and tell the public some version of what they're doing to reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce their waste. Fewer than 15% of healthcare industries produce an annual report. So the healthcare industry has a long way to go in this sector.
Thanks very much, Phil. And John, you wanted to take the one on family planning?
Yes, you think about the two root problems of environmental, the global climate crisis and environmental degradation. One is population, and the other is per person, per capita consumption. And It's been argued that the most important thing we can do to mitigate climate change is to empower women and provide access to education. Absolutely, key point. But I would argue that we are making better gains in family planning compared to our per capita consumption of energy. So it's why we need, it's a problem I think we need to, it's more challenging. So both are extremely important, but I think we're doing better in the family planning aspect. One last point is that regarding pressure on food and feeding the world's growing population, you know, we live off of 7 or 8 crops, period. And we need to think outside of the box and think about growing perennials instead of annuals. We need to have better sources of protein and not just rely on the very consuming, the environmentally damaging consumptive species of plants and animals that we rely on.
Thank you, John. Anybody want to take the shipping question at all? Experts on shipping? If not, just one question. I wanted to ask Renee a question because it goes to the heart of, this is the last question, so you'll be free. But Renee, you brought up something that ties everything together, is how do we do a better job of communicating to the public and to policymakers? Can you share with us that question, your answer to that?
Sure, thank you. So we have to make it personal. I mean, in my opinion, one of the large reasons for inaction around climate change is that it's been an abstract concept, and health makes it personal. And I can think of no better population than those of us within this room as a global health community that has the honor and privilege to be able to holistically get to know patients and populations so we know how to make it personal. So I mean, I can share a story. So I'm an emergency medicine physician and work in a big city, and I still remember this 4-year-old child who came in with an asthma attack. And this was her 3rd in a week, and her mother was exacerbated. It was like 3 in the morning, and as we stabilized her daughter's breathing, we talked about how the increasing pollen levels secondary to CO2 were contributing to her daughter's problems. But we didn't end there. We also had the discussion around checking pollen levels before deciding if her daughter should go outside to play, or making sure that her daughter saw her pediatrician to make sure asthma was under better control before allergy season. And I'd like to hope that that mother left with that clear personal connection to how climate change was impacting her and her family. And I think that last story really highlights my final point, and that's that the best way that we can communicate this is through stories. And I can just imagine the stories that all of you have, and if we can amplify those and amplify and make sure that our patients and communities, that their voice and their story is heard, that is how we have to communicate this issue, because that's how we make it personal, and we make it personal through health. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanette. Absolutely. I think, folks, we've been challenged. We've been told what to do. We know that our planet, if our planet was a patient, a person, that person would be in the intensive care unit. We've been told what we need to do, how we need to do it. I think we've all been challenged by our great speakers here on that we need to get out and save our planet. So let's give our hands, put our hands together again for our great speakers.